And we are live here on Dishing on Division III Women's Basketball. I'm Scott Peterson, and this is Riley Zayas with me here. Kind of our end of the year wrap up show, a little bit weird before the national title game, but we're going to go through a whole host of random topics from teams that we thought were overrated or underrated by the voters, and then some random thoughts on regional rankings and scheduling ideas or gripes with next year, and I think a listener question as well. So we'll get all to that. But first, I wanted to get your thoughts, Riley, on the women's NCAA tournament thus far. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess so. We got one game left in Dallas on Saturday. Looking forward to being there in person to cover it. And, it's a good matchup between Transylvania and Christopher Newport. Now, to get to this point, though, we had some really, really good games, and feels like an eternity ago that we had the first and second round games. But, there were so many teams that you just emerged out of some of those quadrants that we may not have expected. I thought as we got into the national semifinals at Hartford, Rhode Island College was the big story because they went from a team that, to be completely honest, I didn't even think they would get out of the first weekend quadrant. Most didn't. They were in the Scranton kind of quadrant. Scranton was a team I was very impressed with for most of the year. Expected them to be a second weekend team. And Rhode Island College just came out and played their best basketball at the right time. Almost took down Christopher Newport, which would have been crazy to complete a complete run to the championship game. But seeing you did what they do best, and they were able to kind of make that adjustment in the second half defensively, held off Rhode Island College. And then Transylvania, really has impressed me a lot. They were a team, you and I have talked about a little bit, and I know we'll get to later in this show, but I mean, they're undefeated, just like Christopher Newport, and they didn't play the strongest schedule. But what we've seen is that they've been able to step it up and really play the level that, we kind of expected they would in this tournament, not really knowing, though, how the lower SOS would affect them. I mean, they beat Millikan, which is a good win, Ohio Northern, NYU, and then obviously, made that run to the national title game with the win over Smith. So I think it's really, really exciting time in women's basketball because we have so many teams that are in the running. It's not 2 or 3 or 4 that we went into this tournament with kind of thinking, these will be the 4 that emerge. There's a lot of upsets, a lot of really exciting games, a lot of games down to the wire. That Chicago quadrant in the first weekend was super exciting, both nights. So, yeah, I think just biggest takeaway was it was a lot of fun this tournament this year, and I fully expect the national title game to kind of close it out for us in a fitting, really competitive atmosphere.
Yeah, in the NCAA tournament, because it's one win or go home, you can see a lot of more random results than you would see in, say, Major League Baseball's best of 3, 5, or 7 game series. And yet we probably have the national title game that everyone would want to see, except for Christopher Newport's unfortunate injuries. Now, these are probably the 2 strongest teams. They've looked clearly to be among the 4 to 6 strongest teams all year, and they've both played extremely well in the NCAA tournament, and it should be a fantastic final. And I agree, Rhode Island College was a really surprising run because they did not impress me in the Little East final at all. And nothing about their wins have looked fake or unrepeatable. It's not like, oh, we just made 14 threes for a couple games in a row. It looked very sustainable, led by older players, doing very repeatable and impressive things. So they've been a great team. But we're going to get into some of the topics that we wanted to talk about. The first one is we're going to talk about overrated teams. Then we're going to talk about underrated teams. Then teams that maybe the voters thought were kind of spot on. And then our miscellaneous basket of topics. So first off is overrated. A couple things that I wanted to talk about first as far as caveats. We're going to be talking specifically about the D3hoops.com poll. And this isn't specifically trying to roast the voters, of which Riley is one. So could be a little bit touchy. But these voters are able to vote for teams as they see fit. I don't know the internal workings, but my understanding is they're not given like direction of like, there's not chastisement after the fact about like, you put this team 24th and we all think that that's really dumb, so like the voters have a lot of ability to vote to like rank the teams as they see fit. And it doesn't mean that one person is right and one person is wrong. And obviously looking back over the year, we have the luxury of hindsight because we know which teams did end up being really good or going far in the tournament. So that's kind of the poll methodology. Then there's the NCAA methodology, because I'm going to include stats here like what's your NCAA resume, and that is based solely on the NCAA criteria, which are not the only ways to look at a team and decide if they're strong or weak. And then I'm also going to include data from my model. My model really tries to reward what have you done this year? Have you beat strong teams this year, and have you done it impressively? And so my model will not rank a team like Transylvania well because they have not had the opportunity to play lots of strong teams. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means you haven't beat the same number and quality of strong teams that, say, Whitewater has. And then there's also the NCAA tournament, because I'm also going to include when did you exit the NCAA tournament? And there's a lot of randomness there. I think I would bet you that in the final season poll, Scranton is still in the top 10. The fact that they lost, it was second round, right, Riley? The fact that they lost in the second round, it's not like, oh, we'll see, they're not very good. Things happen. You have a poor night, your opponent has a great night. And so that's kind of my bucket of caveats, because we're going to be saying like, hey, this team got tons of votes over the course of the year, and we think they're not very good. And I kind of want to add a lot of context and color before we jump into the really, really mini roast.
Yeah, I would completely agree with all that, Scott. It's interesting, as far as the topic of the D3 Hoops Top 25. You and I talked about this on the last stream that we did or podcast. As a voter, like, we're giving complete, we're able to do what we want with our ballots. And there's a lot of freedom to that. I think every voter really takes it seriously. But we're also in different parts of the country. We're seeing different teams in person. That tends to affect things. The other thing is not many people put out their ballot publicly. So that's not a requirement to put it out publicly. So I think it allows for voters to be a little bit more confident in submitting their ballots, knowing that that information is not going out publicly. The difference, I will say, is the NCAA, those regional committees and national committee, those names are posted publicly. And not that that changes anything, but those people who are selected to those are held accountable for that within their own regions and nationally. So there's a great deal of responsibility. And I think they do a good job with handling that. And yeah, I mean, last point on the NCAA tournament, like, there's a lot of teams. I mean, upsets happen, right? And even as I'm putting together my final top 25 ballot that I think will go out next week, it'll go out after the national title game. There's teams in there that lost, even Sweet 16, that'll stick in the top 15 for me, just because, you're taking the total body of work, at least in my opinion. And so there's a lot of games played, and you're not going to let 2 or 3 games kind of define a season.
Absolutely. So we're going to hit the overrated first. So this is the team that came out as the most overrated by a couple ways that I moved the teams around. So over the course of the year, Amherst got 2,600 total vote points in the poll, which meant they got that's 7.6 per of the 25 voters per week of the poll. And so that meant that Amherst was on average ranked about 18th or 19th over the course of the year. Obviously, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. My model had them 85th as far as what is your results this year. They were not selected for the NCAA tournament, and they were among the final 10 at the Pool C table when the final Pool C selection was made. So do you have any thoughts, Riley, about either Amherst's season or how they might have been viewed by the collective voter?
Yeah, well, and being viewed by the collective voter, I think what you have to take into account is Amherst has been one of those core programs that we've had year in, year out as a top 10, top 15 and at the very least, the top 25 team. And so some of the voters that have been doing this a long time, I don't know this for a fact, but Amherst had a pretty long streak. I don't know exactly how long, but it dated back to 2008 or 2009. And as a longtime voter, I think if you're in that position, it doesn't feel right to not have Amherst in there. They played in a very good league in the NESCAC, and they had a very young team. And I think those two factors probably affected this more than anything. We didn't know how they would do with a younger group that wasn't as experienced. It takes a little bit to learn, that defensive system and kind of the way things are running. Also, I mean, you just consider there were teams like Trinity of Connecticut that we didn't necessarily know how good they were going to be and ended up being very good. So I think Amherst just in this sense kind of got pushed to the back of the NESCAC because they just weren't as experienced as some of the other teams in the league. I will agree, though. I think they were overrated. I thought they were very good early on, but once they started playing more opponents, once they got into league play, we started to see some of those flaws come out.
I'm going to jump back one slide to ask Riley a question that I forgot to ask. So about the D3hoops.com poll methodology, I would love your opinion, but then also, so your opinion on, do you think the ranking should be what have you done so far, or should it be more, if I think if Team A would beat Team B in a game tomorrow on a neutral court, then Team A should be ranked higher? Do you have an opinion on which of those two you would want to use more?
I've heard both used. I know there's a lot of thoughts on this. I tend to favor the total body of work. I feel like that's the best way to understand how good a team really is. One game, in some instances, it might be where I have a team 15 and 16, right? They're maybe from the same league or very close regionally, whatever it might be. And the team that, I think might be 16th beat the team that was 15th. Maybe that would be a room for that 16th team to move ahead, right? But if it's a matter of a team that's separated by more than a couple spots, I think you have to consider, okay, what have they done throughout the course of this entire season? Because in my opinion, everyone can come out and play one really good game, right? And maybe that's unfair, but I think it's when a team's consistent, when they're continuing to win games, continue to stay competitive against good opponents, one game isn't really going to make or break the way that I view them. Now, I know for some people, even Bob Quillman has talked about where, if one team beats another on their home court, so a team lower ranked beats a higher ranked team on the road, then that might be room for that lower ranked team to jump ahead. And I can completely see that. There were instances where that happened with my ballot this year, but I'm always of the mindset you got to take the total body of work.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting push-pull because you want to be backwards looking, but you also want to be forwards looking, and voters are going to have different amounts of balance on each of those. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think your thoughts on Amherst are very correct, where if voters are a little more forwards looking, if you're rolling into Vegas and putting money down, you're probably putting money down on Amherst, right? Like that's a smart way to go. And that probably is a large reason that they got so many vote points this year from voters, but didn't have the on-court results or the NCAA tournament berth to kind of match up with it. That doesn't mean that the voters were wrong, but they were probably the most mismatched between where they were ranked week in and week out and kind of their total body of work this year. Now, it may have been a brief respite for all of Division III women's basketball to have Amherst not be elite because they don't have a senior on the roster, and they were not a slouch. Even if we're saying that they were overrated, and so they could be back to the Amherst of old as soon as first game next year.
And just to be completely clear, like I think overrated from the sense that we just expect them to be like the Amherst teams of old. Like we didn't quite know how good they were going to be. It wasn't the type of thing where they started off super strong and then they just collapsed, right? I mean, they were good early. They beat Springfield, but they weren't great. And so I think, we saw kind of how the youth may have impacted that. But the thing, I mean, you and I have talked about this, like next year, Amherst could be very, very good because all these players are going to be coming back. And that's dangerous now that they've been in the system for a year and GP Gramacki knows what he's doing there as the head coach.
Absolutely. Next team is Rochester. So very similar amount of vote points over the year. They were about 19th and 20th in the as their average ranking each week. And I know that there are statistical problems with using an average. This includes the preseason poll, which I bet you know really should be discounted, but it just kind of lumps all the points together because that's the quickest way to do it. My model had them 35th, so not too far off. They were not selected for the NCAA tournament, and they were at that final pool C table. Any thoughts on Rochester, Riley?
Yeah, Rochester was a disappointing deal. I think what kind of happened with them, if to be honest, and I'd love for coaches out there who are watching this, like, let us know what your thoughts are if you got the chance to watch Rochester at all. I feel like in some instances, Rochester was one of those teams, and quite honestly, similar to Tufts before Sophia Gonzalez stepped up, where Tufts was very reliant on Maggie Russell. A D1 comparison, Iowa with Caitlin Clark. I felt like Rochester relied a little bit too much on Katie Titus, and she was great early. She would put up 30 points in a game, get you double doubles. D2 transfer, did a lot for that program, and I thought she was a phenomenal player. But what I started to see was as they went through UAA play, the first round they were okay, right? But as we got into that second half of UAA play, they were facing teams for a second time. Teams started to know how to guard Katie Titus, and it created a position where Rochester had to score with other players on the floor, and they just weren't able to do enough of that to win in a league as deep as the UAA. I mean, they started off really, really good. They were a team that I didn't have preseason in my ballot or the first couple of weeks, but once they started to beat St. John Fisher and win some of those games, caught a lot of voters' eyes, and they slid up pretty quick to being a top 20 team before that late season collapse where they lost a bunch of games in the home stretch of the year. I think there was a point where they lost 3 straight and they lost their final 2 to NYU and Emory. Just a really tough go around for Rochester because they were a good team and they won some good games early on.
Yeah, they lost 8 of their last 11 games. And I mean, they started off with, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They were 13-1 early in the year, and they did not play an easy schedule. Like they beat Messiah, St. John Fisher, Ithaca, Emory, Case, Carnegie Mellon, and Texas Dallas before they started that kind of, I guess you could call it skid, but also playing NYU, WashU, and Chicago. Those were probably the 3 best teams they played all year, and they lost to them, 6 times. And those were 6 of those final 8 losses. I think this is a really good case for strength of schedule and wins VRRO because Rochester had tons of them, and it could be that they were better than Stevens, a team that that definitely had a better winning percentage, but worse on the other 2. And it's just hard because teams, you do need to beat teams. You can't just be rewarded for playing and losing to teams. But I think Rochester's VRO showed that they had beat those non-conference teams early in the year. I'm not advocating for their 640 winning percentage to be Pool C viable, but I think that they might have been stronger. And so they might actually, this is the overrated section, but I kind of hesitate to say that they were that overrated by the voters. My model had them close. They were at that final Pool C table. Voters had them in the kind of the 20s, and they were 13-1 with a whole batch of really impressive wins.
Yeah, they were very good, and too, like they beat WashU once and they beat NYU once, and maybe they make the tournament, and they were a team. They had played enough good teams; they could have made a run. I mean it's a tough thing when you have a team that starts off really well and then isn't able to close. And I think that's what we had here with Rochester.
They needed just one more win, and I think they would have been in this tournament.
Yeah.
Especially if that win had been over NYU, Chicago, or WashU.
Yep. Agreed.
Or Emory. They went 1-1 against Emory. But so Puget Sound is a team that they were average ranked around 20th to 21st. My model had them better than Rochester, 31st. They did not make the NCAA tournament, and they were not at the Pool C table. They had, I was going to say they had similar wins to Rochester, but that's because I still had Rochester schedules up. They did not have a ton of strong wins earlier. So at the end of the year, Massey really, really liked Whitman. But early in the year, it was really just Whitman and Mary Hardin Baylor as the wins for Puget Sound. And then they didn't really fade down the stretch. They lost to Whitman and Pacific twice. But yeah, I don't know what my thoughts are. I think they were overrated, and I guess I would call them disappointing. But this is another team like Amherst that graduates almost nobody.
Yeah, I really like their prospects heading in next year. Just to that point, the other thing is like when you look at the fact that the 2 losses to Pacific, I think hurt them, but the Northwest Conference was probably going to be a 1-bid league anyway. Like they probably needed to win their conference to get in. I didn't see them getting a Pool C. They played a decent schedule. I mean, they played Trinity of Texas really tough. Beat Mary Hardin Baylor by a point. That was a really good win. They obviously, what they did against Whitman, but I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily call them overrated, though I do think they were high in my ballot. They were up on some people's ballots, I know, just based on the way the poll, kind of turned out early on as we got into January. But then in February, and the 2 Pacific losses pretty much dropped them out. So from that standpoint, I think you could see, there might have been a falling off point. But yeah, Puget Sound, I mean, I'm not really sure what to think if they were overrated or not. I think they met my expectations. I mean, I thought they were going to be good. I thought Whitman would probably be number 1 in that league, and that's kind of the way it turned out.
Yeah, I think, not saying that this is incorrect, but along with Amherst, I think a little bit of historical results might have pushed them up just a little bit higher than a different team would have. So next up is Mary Hardin Baylor, kind of in the 20s there. They were 45th in my model, similar to Puget Sound. They did not make the NCAA tournament, and they were not at the final table. They had kind of a roller coaster of a year, but I think probably some roughly similar things to say about Mary Hardin Baylor as Puget Sound.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, for those who don't know, Mary Hardin Baylor is a team I cover on a pretty much daily basis for another website I run. And I mean, it was a tough year for them. Now that we'll say they have the chance to bring back everybody in the age of transfers and, just people doing different things. Like we don't know if everyone's going to come back or not, but they do have that chance. They didn't graduate anybody, which is really good. The whole thing with their head coaching situation that happened, kind of dropped them a little bit as well. They were really high early on. I personally never had them as high as they ended up getting. I think they got up to between 9 and 12 at one point, but they weren't necessarily able to completely use the strong non-conference to their advantage. The ASC was, there was no real, teams in the ASC that stuck out. Except for Hardin Simmons, and they weren't able to beat Hardin Simmons in either of the 2 times they played them. So I think, they need to win against Hardin Simmons at least once, and then probably need to beat Trinity as well or Puget Sound. And they weren't able to do that. UC Santa Cruz ended up being, and they beat Emory, but UC Santa Cruz and Emory ended up being their 2 regionally ranked wins. There was a potential for a lot more than that. I don't know if they would be overrated. I'm not really sure. I didn't really know what to think of them coming into the year. 8 of their 13 in their main rotation were newcomers. We weren't really sure what they were going to look like. And they played well. They stayed competitive, dealt with some adversity, just weren't able to probably go as far as I think they wanted to, or as far as some people thought they could, if you were asking them back in December, early January.
Yeah. And when I'm saying overrated, I think in hindsight, we can say, hey, Mary Hardin Baylor got 1,700 total vote points over the course of the year, and Rhode Island College got 13 from the preseason poll. And we can say, like, maybe it shouldn't have been quite that different, of course, with the luxury of hindsight. But I wouldn't think that the voters are super far off. Mary Hardin Baylor definitely looks like a team that should have been getting top 25 votes throughout the year, just maybe not quite as high and quite as many as they did.
Yeah, I mean, and really too, like there was a good case for them to be second best in that league. Like there was, between ETBU, UT Dallas, and UMHB, they were all on the race for second. So that was a deep league too. I mean, it was a fun race to watch. But yeah, agreed. I had them in my top 25 for most of the year, never higher than 15 though.
Next up is Springfield. I recall this is a team that I felt floated up early because they had a great record, but not a ton of quality wins. So they did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I think they started off 10-1 with only a loss against Amherst. And so that probably gets you a lot of votes early. But then they pretty quickly lost to Trinity, Bowdoin, Smith, and Babson. So my model had them 73rd. They were not selected for the NCAA tournament, and they were not at the final Pool C table. And to me, this is their resume is the type that feels that, in my opinion, gets overrated by the voters, where it's a team that's 9-2, 10-1, 11-2, but there's not a whole lot of really good wins in there. And especially if they come from a name conference. And so, I mean, I guess you can say they beat Williams and Middlebury. I don't know if we knew that Middlebury was going to be as good as they were early in the year, or even Williams. So I guess you have to rank someone, and it could be that through 10 or 12 games, a lot of teams have not played a whole lot of strong teams. But this is a team that I would have wanted to wait and see a little bit, and then you very quickly start to see them lose.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, too, with some of these NEWMAC, NESCAC teams, like they're going to play a lot of really quality opponents early. And when they do that, I think they tend to get some more votes than maybe they should, when they do play those quality teams. Because like you said, a lot of other teams in other regions aren't playing that kind of competition. Springfield, I mean, they played a really deep league in the NEWMAC. I'd agree there were no super impressive wins. They played an impressive schedule in terms of, the number of non-conference teams they played against. But like you said, I mean, Williams probably ended up being their best win, and that's not top 25 worthy, in my opinion.
Agreed. And that was a home win over Williams too.
Yep.
So that's Springfield. Next up is Calvin. I think not terribly well. See, the thing about Calvin is they beat Whitewater early in the year. And that's the kind of thing that definitely will get you noticed. And so their average rank was around 22nd to 23rd. My model did like them, had them 32nd as far as their total body of results this year. They did not make the NCAA tournament, and they were not at the final Pool C table. So I think that Whitewater win early, and then they lost to Hope and Trine before Christmas. So actually, Hope and Trine end of November, beginning of December, pretty quick that they got into MIAA play. I can see the voters saying, hey, we don't really want to dock you for losing to Hope and Trine. We think those teams are very elite. And you beat Whitewater and you beat Colorado College. So I can see the argument for floating them up. And then actually, they reeled off 4, 5, 6, 10 straight wins between December 30th and February 4th. So they did not lose in January. But they were playing kind of the bottom half of the MIAA. It just happened for their schedule that they didn't play Hope or Trine in that stretch. So I think this is kind of a really interesting team as far as the ebbs and flows of their schedule and who they beat and who they lost to.
Yeah, no, and I thought Calvin looked really good early and really for most of the year. Like that's the tough thing when you play in a league like the MIAA, when you have Hope and Trine in there, is that, to be third best means you still have pretty good year, and you just weren't able to beat those two juggernauts of teams who both were very, very good this year. I mean, Hope was a team that I think, frankly, I thought could go to the Final Four. So, you had some really good teams in that league. Calvin, the Whitewater win is what really caught my attention as a voter. I have a feeling that's what caught a lot of voters' attention. And they kind of hung in a position throughout the year where it was like, okay, they have a few more losses than maybe I would like, but they have played all these really good teams. They still have that Whitewater win. And if you're valuing Whitewater highly, as I was, then you kind of value that win for Calvin over Whitewater a little bit more highly. So I think that was kind of how they may have stayed around the top 25. I don't know I think most voters didn't want to dock them for losing to Hope and Trine because those are games we kind of thought they may not win to begin with. But I think to the bottom half of the MIAA drops your SOS a lot. And so we were kind of looking at the numbers. The SOS wasn't quite there. So, yeah, they had a couple impressive wins, but, they lost to Loris as well. And some of those games just didn't really help their case. They did beat Colorado College, which was a good win that I don't think we necessarily expected would be a good win. But once Colorado College beat Trinity and got on some people's radar, we're like, oh, okay, that might have been a more quality win than we thought it would be, back when they actually won that game.
Yeah, one thing I think is really helpful for the voter is when a team plays all different levels of quality of opponents. And so if Calvin is out here only losing to elite teams like Hope Trine and Loris, and then they beat mostly really bad teams, and then sure, they had the wins over Whitewater and Colorado College, which don't want to discount that at all, but it just means that you're like, I'd love to see you play Springfield or Wartburg or Eau Claire, some teams kind of between Hope and between Alma. And it kind of gives you a little more idea of how good you are, because a team can lose to Hope and Trine 5 times and beat everyone else on their schedule. And we're not really sure if you're the 10th best team in the nation or the 45th. So that's Calvin.
Yep.
UC Santa Cruz is the next. So pretty big jump down. So Calvin got 1,300 vote points over the course of the year. Their average rank was 22nd to 23rd. Santa Cruz only got 825, still 23rd to 24th because those back few spots in the top 25 poll. Of course, there's going to be a lot of range among the teams that are ranked there. My model did like them decently, 38th, so not pretty far off from their average ranking in the poll. They were not selected for the NCAA tournament, and they were not at the final Pool C table. Kind of a similar-ish story for a lot of Region 10 teams between Puget Sound, Mary Hardin-Baylor, and UC Santa Cruz.
Agreed. Santa Cruz was a team that I did expect to go further than they did. I expected them to make the tournament. But, the tough position with a team like Santa Cruz is not only are they in Region 10 on an island, which makes playing, teams tough, finding games tough for non-conference, but now you're in a league in the coast-to-coast conference where you basically don't play a conference game. And so now you're having to try to schedule NAIA opponents, a D1 opponent, a couple D2s. It's just kind of a mix. And that's not going to be a great resume for a Pool C at all. Like they didn't have enough D3 games even to really put them in that conversation. They were regionally ranked and that kind of thing, but they weren't up there at the top of Region 10. And I think that they kind of went back to, the games that they did play against quality teams. We didn't have many of them. And as a voter, you're trying to, see, you don't want to know necessarily how they play against an NAIA opponent. Like you want to see how they play against other D3s and good D3s. They played Whitewater, lost to them in a really tough game. Played Mary Hardin-Baylor, didn't look great. Played East Texas Baptist, didn't look great. They did beat Mary Washington, played Christopher Newport tough, but didn't win that one. And so it was just kind of one of those things where this team had a lot of talent. Keely Murphy, Ashley Kowak, a lot of potential, but they weren't able to win those games. When you have so few really quality games, so few D3 games, it's going to make it really tough for you to not only garner top 25 votes, but also, be in that Pool C conversation, come Selection Sunday.
Yeah, they're probably one of the harder teams for a voter to rank just because of the type of data that they were providing. I'm going to go quickly through this last one because we do have a lot of stuff we want to get through within a reasonable time frame. But Washington Jefferson got a bunch of points. They were around 24th or 25th. My model had them 68th, and they didn't really get close to the NCAA tournament. This was a team that won a lot of games, didn't play a really strong schedule, and I don't know if it was fluky that they lost in the PAC tournament, but it does seem like it is that profile that, hey, tons and tons of wins, especially because late in the year were they 24-1 or something. But similar to Berea, I would love if the voters really looked in. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't, but placed more value on, hey, I'm not sure who you beat here.
Yep. Yep. No, I agree with all that. I mean, you have to look at who teams play, and high wing percentage, really low SOS isn't going to help your case, especially with a lot of voters. I mean, I think people are starting to value SOS more.
So that was our kind of pseudo overrated. So now we're going to hit some underrated, maybe a little bit more fun to talk about. First one was Ripon. I actually have a bunch of teams here, so I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker through them. But they never got a single vote, top 25 vote. My model had them 40th. They didn't really get too close to the NCAA tournament other than a chance to get that Pool A in their conference. But this is a profile of a team that I would love to see get a couple top 25 votes here and there, because they had some really good wins, but they did take some losses against decent teams. And I think that kind of profile often holds them out of getting a top 25 vote.
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree with you on that too. I posted an article the other day on like 5 teams that weren't receiving top 25 votes, never received a top 25 vote actually. Thank you to Scott for that data, but really were valued, on kind of from my perspective in an eye test. Ripon was on this list. They didn't make the tournament, get that Pool A, but they had a really solid year. They're good at position geographically. They schedule well. They scheduled some YACs. They have a chance, I think, year in, year out to schedule some really good teams. I like where they're going. I think they have some really good potential next year if they can return a few players to be really good and maybe cause some havoc in the NCAA tournament. They're one of those underrated one bid league teams that probably should get more attention.
This might be a little divisive to put out there, but I think a team like Ripon, when you're in Region 9, is a strong region. Ripon's it's not likely for them to ever be regionally ranked, but they're a solid basketball team. And because of that, there's not a whole lot of reason to really want to schedule them in non-conference, because they're going to take some losses. So they're not going to super help your SOS. They're definitely not going to hurt it. They will help your SOS, but it's unlikely to be a game versus a regionally ranked opponent. And there's a good chance you lose this game. And that's why I think I do like the shift to say, hey, what is the SOS of a team? Can we use that to contextualize the winning percentage? And have they beat regionally ranked teams? Although we're going to get into some regional rankings gripes of mine. But just to point out, I think a team like Ripon is really unattractive to schedule if you're Loris or Whitewater or Milliken. And I think that's unfortunate, because we would want teams to have the incentive to schedule another team because they're good and not have a disincentive because they're good. So that's Ripon. Another one is Stevens Point. Very similar to Ripon. They did not get any points in the poll. They were not really close to making the NCAA tournament, but they were in the top 50 in my model. Tons of teams not in the top 50 in my model got some votes. And again, like Ripon, this is a profile that I would love to see get, a handful of top 25 votes throughout the course of the year.
Yeah. I mean, WIAC team, I think, they play a tough league. Like, they didn't even make the WIAC tournament, but you could you could even consider the sense that UW Stevens Point may beat and win some leagues just with the quality of opponents that they played. I think it's a hard thing to balance out that win percentage. I think some voters might see the high number of losses and keep them off the ballot. But when you look at the games that they played, if Stevens Point even next year can win some of those games, because they're going to schedule good every year and even good within the league, like there's a path for them to be nationally ranked very easily.
Yeah, they played Milliken, Carroll, St. Norbert, Ripon, Wheaton, and St. Mary's in Minnesota, and Luther, all non-conference. Like, it's a great slate, and they won a good bunch of those games. Next up, we have Hamlin from the MIAC. No points, no votes this year, 54th. So you can tell we're going down a little bit from Ripon and Stevens Point, who are 40th and 49th in my model. That's what I'm sorting by at this moment. They didn't really get close to the NCAA tournament at all. And let's just move on, because I think we're going to touch on MIAC scheduling that really hurts Hamlin. I don't know if it's Hamlin or Hamline, but I'm guessing it's Hamlin. St. Benedict, really same bucket as Hamlin. They're 55th. Everything else the same. Case Western, pretty similar. You can see a lot of these teams showing up here are in pretty strong leagues, right? Stevens Point was in a strong league. So is Case Western. They did not get any votes this year, but they were pretty solid. But probably didn't have that win-loss that looked any good early in the year. Because if you have 2 or 3 losses, you kind of just get put behind everybody that has 0 or 1. But I would bet Case Western had stronger opponents behind even their 2 to 3 losses. Colorado College, they did not get any vote points this year. They were 60th in my model, so they had a pretty good year. Even besides, did they have anything else besides beating Trinity? See, they started off 1-4. They lost to Emory, Calvin, Chicago, and Augustana, which is a pretty brutal stretch to play that early in the year. They also lost to Newport and Trinity, so they scheduled pretty awesome throughout the year. And then they had to play a bunch of really weak teams in their conference, and this is a tough resume to. I can see why it got no votes, but I bet you if you watched them, you're like, hey, this is better than a lot of these teams getting top 25 votes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, watch that Trinity game back, and you'll see just how good they were. Like, they could hold their own against some really, really good teams. And that's where the solid non-conference pays off, right? But when you lose a lot of non-conference games and then you play in a league like the SCAC, it's just not going to be a good formula for being ranked.
Yep. Next up is Skidmore. So we saw them surge late in the year and get that Pool A, taking down Ithaca, but they did not get any votes this year. Kind of a drop down. They were 77th in my model. I don't really remember what their underlying data was like. Skidmore from the Liberty, 815 winning percentage, 539 SOS, and they had 5 wins VRO. But I think, yeah, I can kind of see why they didn't get any vote points, but they were another one that stuck out as surprising to get 0 over the course of the year. St. Norbert. So now these are, I can't remember what's separating these. St. Norbert, 40th. They did make the NCAA tournament. They won their conference. They did not get any vote points. I think that they were a pretty solid team. Eastern Connecticut. So they never, this is really interesting because they didn't get a single vote this year, but they were a Pool C. And I think that's a rare combo to have happen, even though, as we stated, different methodologies. But usually there's a good amount of overlap between those two. And Eastern Connecticut just didn't get any votes. Any ideas, Riley?
I really don't. I mean, I'll be completely honest. I didn't vote for them. They were really close to being on my ballot. I had them on my watch list basically every week. They play a really good league, and we saw what Rhode Island College did, and Eastern Connecticut was actually better than them for most of the year. Now they did lose to Rhode Island College, twice during the regular season or twice during the year, but I honestly think the Babson and Trinity of Connecticut losses early in the year, people wrote them off, which is tough. But I think that sometimes tends to happen. Like if a team doesn't start well, even Colorado College to some degree, you lose a lot of games early or a couple of games, even if it's just like 2 in this case, people didn't know how good Trinity of Connecticut was going to be. And they may have just written Eastern Connecticut off. And then by the time you kind of got that list of teams you're working with of 30 or 40, some people don't want to go beyond that, even if a team below that has kind of proven themselves to be in that mix. And that would be my perspective on what happened.
I think so. Now, what are your thoughts on how a voter should go about constructing their ranking each week? Do you think that they should look at their ballot from the last week and update it based on the week's results? Or do you think there's a different way that you could go about it?
I tend to think if you go to your ballot based the previous week, and you kind of look at, okay, what teams did I have up here? I don't think that should be – I think it should be an outline. I think it should be a sense of, okay, how was I viewing these teams entering this week? How did they fare? But I always think you should be ranking beyond 25. I think that's super important. I think you need to rank down to at least 30 because it's important that you're looking at teams beyond the 25 you have in there and kind of figuring out, okay, if a team 24th lost, I might want to move in somebody. I don't think, though, you should stick too closely to what you had the previous week because things can change, especially early in the year. Once we get into conference play, you can generally stick with a group of teams. You can narrow it down. You can figure out, okay, these are the teams that I really like. They played strong, SOS, strong non-conference schedules. They have the winning percentage, whatever it might be, whatever the case is. But I think, some completely, wipe away what they did the previous week and restart on a ballot. I think it helps to go off of what you had the previous week, but I don't think you should stick to that because so much can change, and you don't want to be too, holding on to what you had the previous week to avoid moving a team 5 spots down if that's where, how far they might need to move down.
Yep, I agree with that. We're going to go quickly through these next, however many other teams that didn't receive a ton of votes, and I think were probably a little bit underrated by the voters. Merchant Marine did not get any vote points. Webster did not. Washington Lee did not. Rhode Island College got only 13 over the course of the year. So, yeah. Roger Williams got only 23. Redlands got 3. Greensboro got 3. Marymount got 37. La Crosse got 46. 9 for Stout, 1 for Augustana, 13 for Carroll. So just kind of a batch of teams that I think had a lot of quality results, but probably didn't have the win-loss to really float up in the eyes of almost any voter for a lot of those that got 0 votes. So we're going to hit spot on. So some ways that the voters probably had a lot of consensus and were exactly right. So Transylvania got the most vote points over the course of the entire year. And I think that we would all agree that is the way it should have happened. So again, my model doesn't like them because they didn't have the opportunity to beat a lot of strong teams over the course of the year, because that is the thing that my model is ranking. But the voters said, hey, we think they're first. They were a Pool A, and they are in the championship game. So they were number 1, and who got the number 2 most votes over the course of the year is Christopher Newport, and they're also in the championship game. And yeah, so if more voters are using it as a forwards-looking prediction, they were absolutely right. Those are the top 2 vote getters of the year. Trinity was 3rd. I think we'd probably all agree that was pretty spot on, despite the fact that they lost in the Sweet 16. The NCAA is quite random. NYU, 4th most, spot on. Hope, 5th most. It's kind of similar to Trinity, Texas. Probably would say that the voters were spot on, with Hope even with Hope losing in the second round. Scranton, 6th most. So, I mean, it's hard to have any quibble with either the fact that those were the teams getting the top 6 most votes over the course of the year, or the order within the 6. I think that those line up pretty well. So now we're gonna hit miscellaneous topics. So this is the NCAA, the winning percentage in the NCAA tournament this year by region, and this really matched what I was seeing over the course of the year as far as region strength, where regions kind of in that, except for region 2, because for me regions 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 were all kind of less strong, and I think that is not captured as well in the stat because region 2 and region 6 both had an elite team, Smith and Christopher Newport, that just continued winning throughout the tournament. And I think that will, because there's not a ton of data behind these winning percentages here, it's going to drag those regions' winning percentages upwards. But I think over the course of the year, that region kind of 7, 8, 9 really seemed 1, 7, 8, 9 seemed like the strong regions, and then 2 through 6 seemed roughly weaker, with 3, 4, and 5 the weakest. And that's roughly what we saw. I think region 10 might be the most disappointing NCAA tournament performance as a whole, because I think that they were I think that they had a bunch of good teams that played well throughout the year, and we probably saw exits earlier than we were expecting for both Trinity and Hardin-Simmons.
Yeah, but they had to play each other, so
that's
that was
right.
gonna hurt.
Okay, so
the whole region 10, yeah.
So that's kind of a fake stat there, right? Because they were pitted against each other so early because of geography. Whereas I think without geography, that region 10 winning percentage would look a lot different and probably would be up around region 6 and 7. Good point. Forgot about that. So winning percentage in the NCAA tournament by win percentage bucket. I hate bucketing teams, but it makes for some nice looking stats. So teams that had over an 800 winning percentage this year, they won 56% of their NCAA tournament games. If you had below, you won only 36%. Those do not sum to 100% because of weirdness dividing because there are a different number of games in each bucket. I stared at it for like 20 minutes trying to make sure that I didn't do math incorrectly. But and then by SOS bucket, so if your SOS was above kind of 549, so you won 60% of your games, and if it's below, you won only 34%. I picked those SOS numbers so that there was exactly 32 teams in each bucket. There is not exactly 32 teams in each of these buckets. So the 32 teams with the better SOS won at basically double the rate. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I really think what we're kind of seeing is, the high win percentage teams generally, I think too, what you got to consider is the high win percentage teams are generally going to have probably more favorable seeding. So that's going to help their chances to win at least one game, in some cases two. We look at the two teams that we have playing the national championship game on Saturday. Both are undefeated. Those kind of things can show you that win percentage certainly does matter. Now, SOS does matter a lot too, though. I think the teams that play those stronger teams are gonna benefit. But I think there's some trade-off, right? When you have the high win percentage teams, they may not always have that high SOS. That doesn't mean they schedule poorly, but a lot of times in a case like even Christopher Newport, like you're not playing in a conference that's elite, right? So your SOS is going to be lower.
Yep, but I was interested that there was such a big difference in winning percentage in the NCAA tournament by these different SOS buckets. So I compared a couple profiles. So this first one was your high winning percentage, low SOS, low wins VRRO. And those are the teams that I have in this bucket. And they won 25% of their games in the NCAA tournament this year. And then on the flip side was your low winning percentage, high SOS, high wins VRRO. And then it was this group of 7 teams, and they won 53% of their games. And I tried to use the teams that I selected for each of these buckets had to be reasonably close, right? I'm not going to just put Scranton in this high winning percentage, low SOS, or they had a high SOS, but I tried to keep teams that weren't too disparate in their underlying data, but the lower winning percentage, high SOS, high VRO teams did better in the comparison between these two buckets, 53% to 25% winning percentage in the NCAA tournament. And this is kind of all of these teams probably were seated in the 15 to 35 range among the 64 teams. Then I also compared some of your more elite teams. So your highest winning percentage, low SOS, low VRO. This is this group. So teams like Gustavus Adolphus or Hardin Simmons that, relatively speaking, had a lower SOS than some of the other higher seeds. And this batch won 47%. And then the flip side was your lower winning percentage, high SOS, high VRO, and they won 64%. And so I keep seeing again and again that having a strong SOS is pretty predictive of doing better in the NCAA tournament. And so I think it is very useful to say, hey, you have this winning percentage, but let's try to look at your strength of schedule and evaluate the two of them in tandem to see like how much meat is there behind the games that you've won. And I think there are teams that play really strong schedules that lose some of those games that it can hide how strong they actually are. And you see on this list, Rhode Island College and Wartburg were probably two of the surprises of the tournament. They went further than you were expecting, but they had strong SOS and many wins VRO. Well, I guess Rhode Island College did. Wartburg had one. Yeah, so I don't know. I didn't really prep you for this, but any thoughts on kind of these profiles that I've constructed or this quick analysis that I've done?
Yeah, I think that second grouping is a really telling number, because I think, in some of those cases, like you go through and you look the high SOS, the one thing like about SOS where you start to look at it SOS does more than just say a team played a good competition, right? There are certain things you can tell by watching a team playing in a high SOS type game, such as how do they fare when they have to go deeper into their bench, right? When you're playing a better team, you're probably going to have to go deeper in your rotation because of foul trouble, because of, just stamina wise, right? Like you're going to be tested more. And those are things that really happen in the NCAA tournament because you're playing high SOS games in most instances in the NCAA tournament. So teams that haven't been in those positions a lot, a lot of times their rotation hasn't been tested like it has. Their backup post players haven't been tested. And so I think that's sometimes where we can start to see some interesting things where teams that go out and schedule really tough, benefit a lot when they're put in those situations in a win or go home situation. I also think, that first group that you put the first group of those two teams, or the first two groups, I should say, a lot of those teams I noticed you have this first group that you have on the screen, a lot of pool A's, the second group, a lot of pool C's. So I think that tells you a lot too as a coach. Like if you're going out wanting to get a pool C, say you play in a tough league, whatever it might be, like you're going to need to schedule well. Like a good win percentage alone isn't going to get you there, unfortunately, because they're looking for more. The committee is looking for more. And you look at the makeup of the teams that receive pool C's, the makeup of the teams that were pool C's and won games, and the common, kind of underlying factors that they played really quality opponents, whether those be in conference or out of conference.
Yep. And obviously there's a limit, right? And I think we're not, or I don't want to speak for Ellie. I'm not saying let's keep valuing SOS even higher and even higher. I think it was a pretty strong balance this year where the pool C's that were selected all seemed very deserving. They seemed like the ones that should have been selected. And as a whole, they did really well in the NCAA tournament. And I think it probably isn't a line written in, paint or Sharpie or something. But saying we don't want to select Rochester with a 640 winning percentage, I think makes a lot of sense because you want to reward teams for winning games, but you want to make sure that you also reward teams for playing and winning against strong opponents, but not requiring them to have beat all of those strong opponents.
Exactly.
So I guess that's an amazing segue that I didn't plan into thoughts on the primary and secondary criteria. I do think the committee did a really good job of contextualizing the data. So winning percentage and SOS, looking at one or the other by themselves, I think tells you almost nothing. And you have to look at the two of them together and go deeper as much as you can to like try to figure out what it truly means. And don't want to harp on calling out teams again, but if you contextualize Washington and Jefferson's excellent winning percentage, it just didn't really hold up, right? And then on the flip side, if you try to contextualize Platteville's strong SOS, many wins versus region-ranked opponents with their winning percentage, you can say like, hey, we know you played a lot of good teams and you did beat a good amount of them, but you weren't close to winning enough. And I think those might be some extreme examples, but good examples of a good job looking at the criteria as a whole. Any thoughts on those two things before I move on?
I think that's super important. I think it's really important to know, like, a committee that can go through and kind of be able to value both at the same time is very important because, again, you're right. If you're valuing or just looking at one, it's not going to tell you a lot because there's a lot of situations where teams at the bottom of leagues, really good leagues, are going to have a super high SOS, but they haven't won, even half their games. Flip side, you have a team, even like Washington Jefferson that you noted a few minutes back, like they won a ton of games, but they didn't play hardly anybody. And so that's going to hurt you as well. And it's going to affect things as well when it comes to the selection process and things like that. So, yeah, I think you're completely spot on with that.
And as we saw on the men's side, there are ways that you can double and triple count SOS that I think can be problematic because if you beat a team with a good winning percentage, there's a good chance that they're regionally ranked. And if the committee decides to go to the secondary criteria, non-conf strength, if you have a good non-conf strength of schedule number, that means that you also probably had it. Well, you have to have had a good strength of schedule number. And so if you compare two teams and you're like, hey, based on the primary criteria, they're pretty equal. Let's go to the secondary criteria. Well, if you're going to use non-conf strength of schedule, then the only way that you said the teams were equal to begin with is because of one team's SOS. And then the tiebreaker is basically their SOS. And I think it's tough because these are the criteria that the committee have to use. But if you decide that two teams are so equal after primary criteria that you want to go to secondary, you're extra counting SOS again.
Exactly. And you're narrowing down things. Like, we're going to get into the conversation about the MIAC, I think, in a few minutes. But like, not everyone has the same ability to play, 10 non-conference games or like whatever it might be. The second, the double counting, triple counting, that's going to be something that I don't really know if there's a good solution to it, right? Like, how do you kind of, unless we come up with a new way to value teams and evaluate how good teams are, like, it's going to be hard. The non-conference SOS is interesting because, again, it comes down to a small group of games. I mean, for a lot of teams, that's 5, 6, 7 games. So I feel like there should be a better way, and a way where you're not going to double and triple count the same number, same games over and over.
Right. So on non-conference SOS, it's pretty widely known, but I'll restate again that there's bad theory behind it, and that like SOS is calculated, roughly speaking, as the winning percentage of all your opponents, and then the winning percentage of your opponent's opponents. But non-conference SOS is not the winning percentage of your non-conference opponents. It looks at their non-conference opponents, which is kind of weird because if you're trying to gauge, say, Tufts, like I went and scheduled Tufts non-conference, but I'm only going to let you decide how good of a non-conference opponent Tufts is by looking at Tufts non-conference schedule. Seems a bit weird. So that's the bad theory part of it, that I know many people have worked hard to change, and it requires very, like, someone to nominate. I don't get it, but
it's a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot. Next up, though, is the bad math. So we think that the D3 amateur analytical community has figured out the exact formula to calculate non-conference SOS. And the belief is that at one level, it includes summing the wins and losses of your opponents. And at another level, it involves averaging the winning percentages of their non-conference opponents. And that's bad mathematically to, at one level, sum wins and losses and then divide them to come up with a winning percentage. But then at another level, average winning percentages. Just because if you average averages, you are overweighting like, it is a big factor if someone has a great non-conference SOS, but they play 2 games versus one that played 9 games. So that's the bad math part that don't take as gospel, but that's what we believe because we were able to match exactly the non-conference SOS numbers reported on the NCAA data sheets. And then this last bit is that you cannot contextualize it. So if you're looking at the primary criteria and you're saying, hey, this team had a 600 SOS, but they won 30% of their games, you can contextualize the two of them together. But when you're left to look at non-conference SOS, I don't believe non-conference winning percentage is a secondary criteria. Do you know if that's the case?
I do not. I feel like it might be. I could find it real fast. Let me look.
We're gonna race. Non-Division 3 win-loss percentage results versus common non-Division 3 opponents.
That's right.
Then division, and then non-conference SOS. So
Yeah.
I mean, you can't contextualize it. So if I played, if my non-conference SOS is amazing and I lost every one of those games, I still win that, and that's a big point in my favor if the committee needs to go to secondary criteria. And I just think you have to contextualize those things. They have the ability to do it reasonably well within the primary criteria, but they don't within the secondary criteria.
Yep.
So the next bit is on regional rankings because results versus regional ranked opponents is such a big deal. Well, if you take the number of teams in each region and divide it, well, you take 7 because there's 7 ranked teams in every division, every region, and you divide it by the number of teams, it's pretty different. And so there's a reason that in Region 2 on the men's side, they only get 6 ranked teams because they're a pretty big outlier. They're a small region. And the fact that beating the number 7 team in a region gets you such it's a big point in your favor, and beating the number 8 team gets you nothing. I think it's just exacerbated by the fact that different percentages of a region are regionally ranked. And so if you are in those regions near the top, 3, 10, 4, and 2, you have an easier time because the likelihood of a team geographically close to you being regionally ranked is just higher. There's fewer teams and more of them are going to be ranked than if you're in regions 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And 1 kind of gets some of that benefit from 2, right? Because they're so close geographically. And so I think this is something that people have talked about. Are there ways to rebalance the regions? And we've been told like they just rebalanced. They're not going to move anything big around. But I think this is just, it's unfortunate. And like, honestly, if I'm trying to quote unquote game the system, I am trying to go find non-conference games from regions 2, 3, and 4 because the chances that those teams are regionally ranked is way higher than me scheduling Ripon. Like I'm going to go schedule Dartmouth or Springfield or Misericordia, and I'm not going to schedule Ripon or Carroll or Whitman.
Yep.
So I think that's just an unfortunate thing that we can't get around the geography. Geography is the way that it is. It's just super hard for Region 10, and it's really easy for Regions 1 and 2 because of the geographic layout. But even beyond that, the way that it just so happens the geographically advantageous regions already also have a way higher percentage regionally ranked. It's just almost a double point in their favor. It's easy to like, I am both pointing in one breath, pointing out that regions 1 and 2 have this huge advantage. But in the same breath, they were awesome in the tournament. They did great.
Yeah.
And so it's not like the teams were fake, at least at the top, but I think it is easier to construct a really, really top resume for multiple reasons in that area of the country.
Yeah, I'd agree. And the other thing is too, like, there's instances certainly where it feels like when you get to the Pool C process, the Region 1, Region 2 teams benefit because they do have, like Region 2, they have that extra maybe chance of having an extra not regionally ranked win that they wouldn't have, if they were in a league where, 14, 15% of the region was ranked. At the same time, I don't think like Wartburg out of Region 9 there at the bottom was probably our last Pool C team selected this year, from what we understand. So I don't think those results, while they can help, I don't think they're completely changing things to so much of a degree that it's really, really hurting the rest of the regions. Though it is something to keep an eye on when you start to look at Pool C selections and different things like that.
Yep. This next slide is cherry picking a little bit because I'm looking at the teams that were ranked 7 from each region in the final regional rankings, alongside their NCAA resume rank, their rank in my model, and their Massey rank. And you can see it's just another way of laying out, like, if you get to play St. Joseph's of Maine and get a regionally ranked win, that's way different than if you had to beat Stout or Mary Hardin Baylor to get that regionally ranked win. And there's not an easy way around this without some RPI thing, but it's just another way to show that even wins against a region number 7 are wildly different in quality.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So then on to scheduling thoughts. So this has been widely talked about in the Twitterverse, but the impacts of the number of conference games is huge. And thinking about the MIAC specifically, 22 of their 25 regular season games are within their conference. And so I think it is very useful to point out again and again that looking at only games within your conference, everybody's SOS is 500. Because one team has to win and one team has to lose. And so within those 22 games, every team in the MIAC has the same SOS. It's 500, which means the only way that their total SOS changes is what all those teams do in those only 3 non-conference games, who they decide to schedule. And this is the reason that we talk about the NESCAC teams having this huge advantage, is because so few of their games are against their conference, which means they have the flexibility and the opportunity to raise their SOS. Now they could schedule teams with winning percentages below 500, and then they would end up with an SOS below 500. But they at least have the opportunity to kind of decide what SOS they want to have. Whereas in the MIAC, even if they go and schedule the top team from the ARC, the WIAC, and I don't know, their Northwest Conference or something, they're probably not going to get an SOS above 540 or 535. So you could actually say Gustavus Adolphus and Concordia Moorhead, who had really poor SOSs when stacked up against NCAA tournament teams, it could be they almost had the highest SOS they could have mathematically,
Yep.
unless they went out and just decided to schedule Christopher Newport, Smith, and Transylvania. And so I don't think people realize that your SOS is 500 among your conference games. And the MIAC is, again, I have no idea who makes the decisions. I don't know if there are other factors in play. I'm not a school administrator. I'm not an athletics director. But their teams almost have, like, I don't know if there's a possibility for the MIAC to get a Pool C under the current way that it's laid out. They would have to, you would basically have to schedule Christopher Newport, Smith, and Transylvania non-conference and win them all.
Yeah. I mean, I just can't understand, and I'd be interested to know like why the MIAC does this, and I really don't know if anyone knows for sure, but the double round robin, it makes it convenient for scheduling purposes because it allows those teams to only have to go out and get 3 non-conference games, which can help you financially. It can help you in other ways with travel and keeping things close. But from a perspective of getting your league exposure nationally, getting your league's teams ranked, like I don't think the MIAC will ever have more than one team ranked. Just because they, as you said, like the SOS just isn't ever going to be there. There's no way you're going to be able to go out and unless you're just a great team, but you're not ever going to have a team that, I can think of maybe one instance where maybe there's 2 teams really close at the top. One wins the conference championship game, the other, ends up being in contention for a Pool C. But that's going to be tough, like because you're right there in a region with all the WIAC schools who are completely different, and they play a ton of non-conference games. So I think geography-wise too, like they're in a region that's tough to win in and be regionally ranked in. And so from that standpoint, I just don't think there's a Pool C possibility for the MIAC with keeping this, double round robin. It doesn't make a lot of sense to play 22 conference games because as you said, Scott, like it doesn't help your SOS at all. Your SOS is going to be 500 in your conference. You only get 3 non-conference games. That's not giving those coaches much room to work with.
Yep. And we're just saying how much the MIAC regular season schedule limits the ability of these teams to create an NCAA resume. We're not saying these teams are bad. We know Concordia is a solid team, probably beats a lot of the Pool C teams if they were matched up this year. It's just that NCAA resume wise, they don't stack up because you can't see evidence that they have played a strong schedule.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. Like, put 20 conference games on the schedule. Give your teams 5 because it would show, it would give Concordia a chance to have gotten in this year. I truly think if they had played 5 non-conference games, they're in a great position geography wise. They could go out and get 5 really good opponents, win 4 of them, and be right there on the Pool C table come Selection Sunday.
Yep. So let's see here. Non-conference, they played Minnesota Morris, Amherst, and Sal Virginia. And so even with those 3, if Concordia adds 2 and plays, I don't know, Luther of Iowa and Northwestern of Minnesota, it could be that they are in Pool C, and they could have been ranked maybe even ahead of Wartburg in the region, right? And yeah, there's just playing that many conference games is an anchor on your NCAA resume. It just drags it down. And so one thing that Riley and I were going back and forth on is, if we were the sports or the athletic director of a conference and we could just pull the marionette strings, what do we do? Well, you want the worst teams in your league to have as good of a winning percentage as possible. And so you want them to schedule the worst possible teams, because their winning percentage affects everyone else's SOS more than their opponent's winning percentage. So like, let's pick on the SCAC. Austin College went 1-24. If they're playing other teams that are 1-24 level and winning half of them or a third of them, even though those teams will not help out Austin College's SOS, the ripple effect on the SOS on everyone else in the entire conference is huge. Like, if Austin College is, instead of 1-24, if they are 6-19, it's massive, right? Same with Earlham in the Heartland. Same with Kalamazoo in the MIAA. And so if you're wanting to maximize the NCAA resumes of every team in the conference, you want your worst teams to play as the worst quality teams that they can so that they get wins. And then you want your best teams to play teams with the best winning percentages that you can, like almost the opposite. So, I mean, Washington and Jefferson would be the ideal team to schedule if you could, if you're Pennsylvania or Ohio Northern or Messiah. Because it doesn't matter as much if you actually win the game, because you get a VRO result. It helps your SOS a ton. And as long as you're not, losing Rochester number of games, you're going to be Pool C viable. And we saw with Tufts resume was valued really, really well. They played so many good teams. Their SOS was incredible. They lost a good handful of games too, and they still were valued quite well. And so top teams in the conference, you got to go find the absolute best winning percentages. And it doesn't, like, go on the road, even if the chances of winning aren't high. Those are the ways to maximize the resumes of your entire conference.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think you said it best, but just to kind of add to that, like, yeah, I mean, if you're trying to look at it and see who is scheduled, it's very tempting to probably try to get a lower team to schedule, especially coming off of a break or going into a break, when those are hard times to kind of get your team up and going, whether it be at the end of a semester or coming back from semester, whatever the situation is. But 1 or 2 games can really hurt you, especially if you play in a league that doesn't have a great bottom half. In a case like the SCAC or the MIAA or the Heartland, so you need to go out and maximize the number of non-conference games you get, because this can really, really change the way your resume turns out, especially too, like we're talking currently, you may not be able to get the bottom teams in your league to go schedule other bottom teams in other leagues, but you can control what your schedule turns out to be and how you go out and get non-conference games.
Right. If I'm Loras and Wartburg and Gustavus Adolphus and Concordia, I'm saying, let's play 2 non-conference games against teams each other every single year. We'll do home and away, alternate years. And because it doesn't matter a ton if you win those games, the impact on your SOS is huge. And you're going to need that come selection time. And then some wishes. So we're picking on the SCAC a lot. But I think looking at Trinity, Texas, I think it's so unfortunate, kind of on the flip side. I said, to maximize those resumes, you want the worst teams in your conference to play as poor of a team they can. But we shouldn't have a system where Trinity of Texas, if their resume is hurt by beating Austin College twice a year. I mean, I think that sucks. I don't think it should help their resume, but it shouldn't hurt it at all. And right now it hurts it. It hurts Transylvania to beat Earlham twice a year. It hurts Hope and trying to beat Kalamazoo twice a year. And I don't think we want that. Because, I mean, as I laid out in how to maximize resumes, there's zero reason for Hope to go play Earlham non-conference, like zero reason at all. And I mean, maybe we don't want that anyway, but teams are rewarded for losing to an elite team and they are punished for beating a really bad team. And I think the impact to their resumes for doing those two things should be a lot closer together than it is right now.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And the one thing I do want to make clear for coaches out there watching, or even just fans, like, we understand that there's financial constraints. There's also situations where these elite teams, they try to go out and schedule other elite teams, and the teams are trying to schedule say no, we don't want to come play you, or we just So I think too there's some misconceptions about what playing another elite team can do. I don't think enough people realize that it will help you a lot. I think they think if we play and we take a loss, that's going to hurt us, when really it won't. So I think those are some of the other factors that play into this. I know some coaches have tried to go out and get their teams really good non-conference games. It just hasn't worked out for one reason or another. But I think if you have the opportunity to do so, it's only going to help you. And you got to consider too, like, what is the impact of the conference going to be, and how can I kind of maximize or offset that with a non-conference schedule?
Right. And so another example, two teams that had from the same conference that had almost an identical resume were Wisconsin Oshkosh and Wisconsin Eau Claire. Take those two teams. If one of them decides to schedule Milliken non-conference and they lose to them, and then the other team decides to go schedule the worst team in some conference around, say Beloit, and they beat them. Well, the team that lost to Milliken, their resume is actually going to look better than the team that beat Beloit. And I think those are very, very close data points. But I think a big problem that is unlikely to be overcome is that we have to create data for the NCAA committee to look at that spans the entire year and not pull out individual results. And when you lump everything together, you lose the ability to see, like, oh, this winning percentage includes, like, they lost games against the four best teams, or their SOS is because they beat 8 teams with terrible records in their own conference. And I think that's just a tough thing that we can't really get away from unless you lean really heavily into that RPI type system where each result gets kind of almost a value, and you can see, like, oh, they beat this many top 30 RPI, this many top 70, this many top 120, and they have this many losses against teams outside of the top 150. Like, you have to have that ability to be able to pull apart the data that we, like, the committee literally is not, they have no ability to right now, because they look at winning percentage as one number, and now SOS is one number. So if we're talking about wishes, it would be and give them some tooling and ability to pull it apart, because teams in weak conferences, but that are elite themselves, their resume underrates how good they are.
Yeah, that made my wish too. I think you need to see these games played. I think too, like, my wish honestly would be that more people, I think, understand how this whole process works. Like, I don't think people quite understand, especially when it comes to these athletic directors and coaches. Like, if you're newer to Division III, like, this is a unique system compared to Division I or Division II. So I think it sometimes takes some time, to understand really what you need to be doing to put yourself and your team in a good position. And so, I just don't think there's enough education out there to understand kind of all this data and, like, how it affects you, and how playing a game in November will come back to either help you or hurt you in March.
Right. Like, two teams at that final Pool C table were, I believe, Amherst and Springfield. And they had a result from the first game of the year where they played each other that probably the loser of that game was never going to be considered for Pool C because of the first game of the entire year that they played. All right, 2 final things to hit. So I've been starting to track rosters that return a ton. And so all of the rosters on the screen right now did not get any minutes, points, or rebounds from someone marked as a senior. And so look for great things, or at least big pushes up from all the teams listed here. One exception is Loris. they do have seniors, but I've heard that everybody's coming back, to the chagrin of all the teams around them, because they're going to be amazing. But it's really cool to see so many teams here that are bringing back everybody. And then on the flip side, some schools that have a lot of production, so again, minutes, points, and rebounds, listed as senior. So actually, this is the how much this is the percentage of minutes, rebounds, and points that are returning. And so these numbers will probably rise, because I bet you there are players on these teams marked as senior that will come back for a fifth graduate year. I don't know that for basically every team. I only know about it for a couple. But you can see, like on the previous slide, everyone's bringing back 100% here, and then these teams are bringing back a quarter or less. And, it happens every year, and there's ebbs and flows across the country.
Yeah, the interesting thing now is, and we talked about this on Hoopsville with Dave, a couple of times, I think, if I remember right, even going throughout the year, like we're in such a different time because we still have these COVID years and we don't know who's coming back, who's not. Like, it used to be where you could see a senior on a roster and you were like, okay, they're not going to be back next year. Now you don't really know. And so it's kind of a wait and see game till teams release rosters. Obviously, you and I talk to coaches. Sometimes we know about things beforehand, but you're not really going to know who's all coming back. And some people haven't even made their decisions, right? So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. But I do think teams like on that previous slide, teams like Ohio Wesleyan, who really, really look good to me. Amherst, we talked about them. Loras, there's a lot on that list that really have some potential that didn't receive a lot of national attention this year, but could be very good next year.
I think the North Coast Athletic Conference is going to see some surges. They're a really, really young conference, headlined by Ohio Wesleyan and Wittenberg, but there are young teams throughout. So in the last bit, we had a comment, a listener question on our live stream that I think is a great comment. In your scenario above, so we must have been talking about comparing some teams maybe for Region 6 regional rankings. What would a team have to have, or a combination of, with SOS, RROs, and winning percentage to overcome a head-to-head loss? So one team is 1-0, and the other team is 0-1 head-to-head. What do you think, Riley?
Man, that's a math question for you. I don't know, but it's interesting kind of when you start to think about this, because there are instances, especially teams with within close proximity in regions. Like we just talked about it with Region 1, Region 2. You also have that a little bit with Region 8 and Region 9, where you're going to have some cross-region games, and those can impact you when you start to look at things. I don't quite know what the exact number would be. I would think, though, that a head-to-head loss is you're going to have some significantly greater numbers in at least I would think 2 of those 3 categories. What do you think?
Yeah. So let's first talk about 1-0 head-to-head versus 0-1. I think the team, I still want to look at body of work, right? And so the team that lost to that head-to-head, I think, needs to make up about a 2 or a 3 win gap. So, that's probably 40 to 60 points of winning percentage. It's maybe 15 to 30 points of SOS, and probably have to have a better VRRO or something around that. And obviously, if they're way better in one of those 3, then they don't have to be quite as much better in the other ones, or could even be behind. But I would say roughly 2 to 3 games. And then if we're talking about conference opponents, if you're 2-0 versus a team and another team is 0-2, I think we're talking about a 4 or 5 kind of total game difference in resume that I would want to see. And then, so a question for you, Riley. This Matt Snyder kind of made an interesting statistical analysis on the men's side when Heidelberg was regionally ranked and Calvin wasn't, where he said, let's take away Heidelberg's 2 losses to John Carroll, who's a strong team, and take away 2 of Calvin's wins against, I think it was Alma, a weak MIAA team. And then you saw, now their SOSs are equal, and Calvin is 40 points better in winning percentage. Do you think that's the kind of thing that either D3hoops.com top 25 voters can or should do, or things that the committee should do when trying to equate 2 teams that have different types of resumes, like high winning percentage, low SOS, and then the inverse. Like, do you think it's even like reasonable to kind of add and subtract results that did happen throughout the course of the year?
I personally don't think so. I also don't think that would be something allowable for the committee to do, because I think then there starts to become some controversy. Okay, what results are you going to be adding and subtracting? How are you going to go about doing that? Right, like in Matt's example, I mean that made a lot of sense. But I think it gets hard when you're trying to look at like from a committee perspective, like, okay, how do we kind of, because if you pull away 2 results here and add 2 results here, whatever it might be, like, adding and subtracting could kind of get to be tough and controversial when you're trying to make those decisions. I don't think top 25 voters are going to go, maybe in depth isn't the right word, but I don't know that that's the kind of thing that they're going to be considering. Committees, like, I think if you figure out a good way to do it, I think it could be valuable. But I think at this point, just kind of not having a clear set way to go about doing that could create some controversy when it comes to making those picks and making those decisions between 2 teams.
Yeah, I think it's something that probably makes logical sense to do, but maybe not reasonable logistical sense for a committee, something that they're even able to do. But I think, I mean, going back to the Warburg women getting in at that 19th pool C, you could try to pick apart their resume and say, like, hey, they went 1-6 VRO. Are they being rewarded in their 584 SOS largely in games that they lost to good teams? And then at the same time, because it's phrased as results versus region ranked opponents, I've heard that the committee can see, like, oh, they have 6 losses on the year, and all of those losses were to region ranked opponents. So you're almost rewarded extra for losing games to regionally ranked opponents because it helps your SOS. You're not really docked for losing those games, and the committee can say, like, hey, those are the only games that you lost. So it seems like a potentially weird combination of data where I guess I wasn't really going to a point, but it seems interesting it's a way that the committee really isn't able to pull apart the data, right? Which is what I touched on earlier. And so you're looking at Warburg's SOS. It is strong. They do have a better winning percentage than anyone they're compared against. And so you can kind of contextualize their SOS with the VRO by saying it's only high because of games that they lost. But at the same time, both their winning percentage and SOS were among the highest among the teams that they're being compared against. So it's like, how much do you back out those 2 that we've already kind of contextualized against each other that are already better than everybody else?
Yeah, for what I've heard too, though, I mean, they had a strong non-conference SOS. This is a situation where non-conference SOS can come into play, and I think it did here. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like there's some interesting things. I think there's limits to how far we can how far the committee can look into the data. Obviously, we can go very deep into it. I think the committee does what they can with what they have available. But yeah, it's interesting thing to look at. Like, I would have to think, like you said, like if their 6 losses were all the regionally ranked opponents, like that's something that should be considered, right? Like they didn't lose to anyone that we thought they should have beat, if that makes sense.
Sure, but then on the flip side, are you allowed to say this team lost 2 games to not regionally ranked opponents?
Exactly.
Because we can see how many regionally ranked losses they do have and total losses? Or is this not considering? Would that be considered to be outside the bounds of any of the primary criteria? Because it's not results against regionally ranked opponents. And so it feels weird that you could almost be rewarded for losing only to regionally ranked opponents solely because the committee can't really dock you extra for losing to a not regionally ranked opponent.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a tough thing. I mean, I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. And I think committee by committee, it probably varies. But I do think they are limited. Like, I know they have to follow these criteria very closely. So I don't know how much kind of wiggle room they have to kind of work with some of those things. Because, yeah, it can get to be tough. Like, there's different teams that, okay, this is a plus here for this team. This is, but on this, on the other hand, like they don't have this that this other team has. So yeah, I mean, I think when you start trying to value losses, like it can get to be tough too. Like I don't know if there's any perfect way to go about doing that.
Right. I mean, it does sound like there's also a desire for however the teams are selected, for the criteria to be able to be understood, right? We're not going to have some double linear aggression with AI retrofit, all that, and so because of that, there is definitely a limit to how far you can go, because some of these ranking systems are really, really complex, right? That we see in the NBA or in Division One, or
Yeah.
I mean, even the stuff that Drew Pasteur does, he's simulating teams based off of underlying data, and there's a lot of really, of course, mathematically sound, but really complicated stuff that probably would not be a sell to the NCAA for something that to adopt, to have committees do and try to explain to coaches.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so we've reached the end. So thanks again to anyone who's gotten this far and listened to it. Riley and I both have Twitter accounts. Those are scrolling across the bottom. You can shoot us Division III basketball questions whenever. Riley's got a Substack that he is publishing regularly. I've got a website that I put up random statistical analyses every now and then. I know my website's going to be pretty quiet in the off season. I don't know how quiet your newsletter is going to be, Riley, but I'm sure come October, both will be cranking at top form.
We'll be ready to go. Need to take a little bit of time off. It's been a crazy, you and I both. I mean, we've been in this almost daily for the last, I don't know how many months, but I'll have stuff going out regularly. I mean, we'll get into coaching news and off-season stuff, but maybe some interesting, analytical, analysis type articles. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun this year. I mean, it's been cool, and I think we at least for me personally, I learned a lot just through this year being more involved in it, and going into more, learning about the data and the different criteria. So it was as much of a learning experience for me as it was for hopefully everyone who read the Substack and, followed us on Twitter.
Yeah, I don't know how many people would be in the conversation, but how does it feel to probably be like one of the 10 most knowledgeable people in the world about any topic? And this topic is Division III women's basketball.
I know it's I mean, hey, it's been a lot of fun. Like you're getting to, I mean, I've had so many coaches just reach out to me and like just want everyone to know like how much that means. I know, Scott, you've had some coaches reach out to you. Like it means a lot when people reach out to you, asking you questions or just telling you, hey, thank you for what you're doing. Like, I mean, we don't do this for money. We don't do this, we do it because we have a passion for it. And we just love to, learn about Division III basketball. And I think too, women's basketball deserves some more recognition, deserves some more coverage. And that's kind of what part of my desire was, to kind of get involved in this and learn more about it. I didn't know a whole lot going in this year. I knew a good amount, but have definitely become more knowledgeable over the last 5 or 6 months. So it's been pretty cool.
It's been real fun. So thanks again to everyone. And we don't have any fancy catchphrases or ways to end it. So we'll just say that's the end.
We'll see you later.